Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. We're the podcast where we dive deep into significant texts, pull out the core insights so you can stay informed without getting, totally bogged down. Today, we're unpacking a really thought-provoking one, Bourgeois Dignity, Why Economics Can't Explain the Modern World by Deirdre McCloskey. This isn't just like your standard economic history. It's a real challenge, isn't it, to a lot of assumptions about how we got here, how the modern world even came to be. She asks this huge question: what really drove that incredible explosion of wealth and innovation over the last couple of centuries? She argues it wasn't just the usual suspects, capital, resources, maybe even exploitation, something much more subtle. So what's the big idea here, sort of at a glance, and what are the main themes she gets into?
Yeah, it's fascinating. McCloskey basically says that this dramatic, almost unbelievable rise in global wealth, she calls it the Great Fact, which is a great term, tract. It wasn't primarily driven by those things we always hear about, capital accumulation, natural resources, even big scientific breakthroughs. Instead, she argues, it was a fundamental shift in ideas and rhetoric, basically how people talked about and thought about markets and innovation. That was the real catalyst, she says. This shift, she calls it the bourgeois revaluation, gave dignity and liberty to, the middle class, the entrepreneurs, the innovators. And that became the engine. The book then kind of systematically takes apart the usual material explanations. And ultimately, she pushes for like a remoralization of economics, recognizing that human virtues beyond just, pure self-interest really matter.
Wow, okay. That's a huge claim right there.
Yeah.
That just changing how people talked about merchants could reshape everything. It flies in the face of so much standard economic thinking, right?
It really does.
So before we get into the how of that shift, let's really get a handle on the scale. This great fact she talks about. Just how big was this transformation?
Oh, the numbers she uses are genuinely mind-boggling. McCloskey points out that just 2 centuries back, the average person worldwide lived on about the equivalent of $3 a day in today's money. Think about that. The entire global economy was kind of like present-day Bangladesh. Poverty wasn't an exception. It was basically the human condition.
$3 a day.
Yeah. Now today, in places like, say, Norway, the average income might be $50,000.
Yeah.
And worldwide, the average income has jumped by a factor of at least 16 since 1800. 16 times.
16 times. That's, incredible is the word. Almost miraculous, really. But, whenever we talk about huge economic growth, the immediate question is always, okay, but who benefited? Was it just the rich getting richer? How does she tackle that?
Right, that's a crucial point. And her answer is pretty striking. She says, the poor won.
The poor won.
Yeah. Now, okay, profits from a new invention, maybe they go to the entrepreneur first, sure. But McCloskey argues that pretty quickly, in the second act, competition forces prices down relative to wages. So what happens is this massive expansion of goods and services becomes available to everyone. The whole income distribution shifts upwards, meaning the very poorest people have seen the biggest real benefit since 1800.
Okay.
And it wasn't just about feeling a bit happier, like pot of pleasure happiness, she calls it, which maybe wasn't that different in 1800. No, it was about increasing scope, a vastly wider range of choices, freedoms, possibilities that were just unthinkable before.
Scope. Okay, explain that a bit more.
Well, think about it like this. Electric lights instead of flickering candles. Tens of thousands of times more light for the same amount of work.
Mm.
Or anesthesia instead of just whiskey for surgery.
Yeah.
Imagine the reduction in sheer suffering.
Yeah, unimaginable difference.
Exactly. Or, 3-car garages instead of tiny closets, airplanes, insulin, telephones. Life didn't just get quantitatively bigger. It got qualitatively richer in ways money barely captures. It's like a liberation from age-old limits.
Right. So not just more stuff, but a fundamental leap in daily life, in human potential. Okay, this is where her argument really takes that turn, isn't it? If it wasn't just more capital or resources, or even, as she argues, exploitation, what was the secret ingredient? What fueled this huge free lunch that pulled so many people out of poverty?
And that's where she brings in this idea of the shift in habits of the mind, or as she puts it more sharply, habits of the lip.
Habits of the lip, meaning how people talked.
That's exactly how people spoke about and therefore how they valued economic activity. McCloskey argues that around 1700, especially in northwestern Europe, places like Holland and Britain, something profound changed. People stopped essentially sneering at market innovativeness and the everyday virtues of, the bourgeois life. Before this, think about it, the merchant, the inventor, the person making deals, they were often looked down on by the aristocracy, by the church. Profit-seeking was seen as kind of grubby, right? maybe necessary, but not noble.
So this wasn't just a subtle shift in attitude then. It sounds more like a public relations revolution for business people. Like society suddenly decided being an entrepreneur was actually respectable, maybe even admirable.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Eh.
This bourgeois revaluation, as she calls it, meant public opinion swung in favor of the bourgeoisie, especially their knack for marketing and innovating. You see it reflected in big thinkers like John Locke, Adam Smith. They started talking about justice in ways that included everyone, not just the elites. It even pops up in literature. Samuel Johnson, a real conservative Tory, was writing passionately for innovation in the mid-1700s. Voltaire, visiting England around 1733, was amazed that a peer's brother does not think traffic, meaning trade, is beneath him. That was revolutionary.
Huh. Because elsewhere, that would have been unthinkable for nobility.
Absolutely. So this whole rhetorical shift elevated what she calls bourgeois stick-to-auditiveness, that practical, persistent, sometimes messy way of solving problems and creating things over just, aristocratic gestures or inherited status. And crucially, it wasn't just about prudence, like being careful with money. It was about valuing things like inventiveness, daring, enterprise, these non-prudential virtues, taking risks, trying new things.
Non-prudential virtues, like courage and hope, apply to business.
Precisely. She really emphasizes, in the beginning was the word. Free innovation, the kind that drove the great fact, it flowed directly from this new admiration and liberty. Other societies, maybe they had trade, maybe they had sophisticated culture, but they didn't have this explosion because they kept innovation sort of off stage. They couldn't quite imagine how empowering it would be. So it wasn't a new resource or technology that was the primary spark. It was a new story society told itself about commerce and invention.
That is, yeah, a really powerful, counterintuitive idea. That words literally change the world. But okay, this goes against so many standard explanations, doesn't it? The ones we learn in school. McCloskey really takes them on directly, right? She tries to systematically refute them.
Oh, absolutely. She spends a huge chunk of the book doing just that. It's quite methodical.
Let's unpack a few of the big ones she argues against. What about, say, thrift? The idea that people just started saving more, accumulating capital.
Right, that's a classic one. The Protestant work ethic. Save your pennies, invest, and boom, industrial revolution. But McCloskey pours cold water on that. She points out, look, even today, savings rates in rich countries are rarely above, 10, 20%? And back in medieval times, life was so precarious, there just wasn't much surplus lying around for grand, innovative projects.
Okay.
And serious economic historians, people like Abramowitz, Kendrick, Solow, back in the 50s, they crunched the numbers and found that routine saving, routine capital accumulation, only explains a pretty smallish fraction of modern growth.
So the math doesn't add up.
Not for that scale of change, no. And that whole idea of primitive accumulation from Marx, that you needed some initial hoard of capital, maybe stolen or extracted somehow to get things going.
Yeah.
McCloskey calls that blackboard logic. It sounds neat theoretically, but historically, she says, it doesn't really fit. Early industrial innovations were often funded by, profits plowed back into the business, trade credit between merchants, fairly modest loans, not vast piles of pre-existing cash.
Right.
What the bourgeois revaluation did, she argues, was it encouraged investment in human capital-skilled people, creative thinkers, by giving them the freedom and respect to try things.
Okay, so thrift alone doesn't cut it. What about the darker explanations? Exploitation, colonialism, slavery. These are really common arguments today, that Western wealth was built on the backs of others. Surely that played a huge role.
Yeah, this is a really critical and often contentious part of her argument. She looks at this very closely. She argues that the static gains, meaning the one-off benefits, not the ongoing engine of growth from things like the slave trade or imperialism, were actually small relative to the overall explosion of wealth.
Yeah.
Just not big enough to explain that factor of 16 increase.
Small. That seems counterintuitive to many people.
It does. But she provides examples. Like, she notes that India's own cotton mills were allowed to grow in the late 19th century, which sort of contradicts the idea that Britain relentlessly crushed all competition. Or she points out that the average Dutch person didn't actually get much richer from Holland's empire in the 19th century. The benefits were very concentrated. It didn't fuel broad national prosperity in the way the theory suggests. And even things like monopoly capitalism, she argues that, yeah, monopolies might get huge profits for a bit, but competitors usually rush in, and those supernormal profits get competed away pretty fast. So sustained growth isn't really driven by ongoing exploitation or these massive, unfair gains for just a few. She even makes the point that figures we often see as robber barons like Carnegie or Rockefeller were operating within the ethical norms of their time, and their fortunes mainly came from innovations that ultimately benefited millions by lowering costs.
That's definitely a challenging perspective for many. Okay, what about more tangible things? Geography. Britain had coal, right? Or just trade itself. Don't those seem like obvious drivers?
Good points. She addresses those too. Coal, she says, yeah, it definitely influenced where industry is located. You needed power. But it doesn't explain the sheer scale of the revolution or why Britain, specifically, gained so much overall. China, for example, had massive coal reserves too, but didn't industrialize in the same way or at the same time.
Right, so coal was necessary but not sufficient.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If coal alone did it, why not China centuries earlier? And trade, she argues, is similar. Trade is no engine for this kind of growth, she says. The gains from trade are usually about efficiency, specialization important, but typically small, static gains, not the kind of exponential liftoff we saw. If just having extensive trade networks could spark an industrial revolution, she asks, why didn't it happen in, say, Song Dynasty China around 700 CE or ancient Egypt? Both had huge trade networks. Something else was missing.
And that missing piece, for her, is the rhetoric, the dignity.
Precisely.
Okay, two more big ones often cited. Institutions and science. What about strong property rights, rule of law? And wasn't science the bedrock of all this new technology?
Right. Institutions are huge in modern economics. Secure property rights, rule of law, absolutely vital. But McCloskey argues they are necessary background conditions, but again, not the sufficient cause, not the spark. She points out that pretty secure property rights existed elsewhere much earlier. China, India, the Islamic world, even ancient Rome had forms of property security, sometimes better than early modern Europe.
Huh.
England itself had pretty strong property rights, arguably since Magna Carta in 1215, centuries before industrialization really took off. So if institutions were the main driver, why the massive delay? Why did it happen specifically in Northwestern Europe around 1700, 1800? The timing doesn't quite fit if institutions are the only story.
Okay, makes sense. And science.
Science, she argues, was more like a sibling, developing alongside the Industrial Revolution rather than being its direct parent. Many key inventions, think Bessemer steel, even things like early chemotherapy, were actually used effectively for decades before anyone fully understood the scientific principles behind why they worked.
Really? So it was more tinkering and engineering than pure science driving it initially?
Yeah, a lot of it was, yeah. McCloskey has this great line. Mere curiosity and originality by a handful of Galileos and Newtons does not an industrial revolution make. Brilliant science is one thing, but turning it into mass prosperity requires something else. And that something else, she argues, was the bourgeois revaluation. It gave engineers, craftsmen, practical innovators the social permission, the dignity, the liberty to experiment, fail, tweak, and try again on a massive scale. It was a broader cultural shift towards valuing novelty and practical problem solving across society, not just in the lab.
Okay, so pulling this all together, if it wasn't primarily capital or exploitation or geography or institutions or even science alone, what does this radically different explanation mean for how we think about progress today, and maybe even for economics itself?
Well, the core takeaway is kind of stunningly optimistic, actually. It means modern economic growth was essentially a massive free lunch.
Free lunch. Economics usually says there's no such thing.
I know, right? But she means it wasn't primarily about just moving existing resources around or taking from Peter to pay Paul. It was driven by discovery, an explosion of innovation that created entirely new value, new possibilities, baking a much, much bigger pie, not just fighting over the slices of the old small one. And this discovery, this innovation, was spurred by those non-prudential virtues: hope, courage, integrity, creativity, motivating people, not just cold calculation or greed.
That definitely sounds like it requires a different kind of economics, doesn't it? One that goes beyond just prudence only, beyond scarcity and rational self-interest as the only drivers.
Absolutely. She explicitly calls for a remoralization of economics. If innovation and prosperity really flow from ethical shifts, from valuing human dignity, liberty, and these broader virtues, then economics needs to take ethics seriously again. If the whole modern world wasn't fundamentally built on theft or exploitation, except maybe at the margins briefly, then we can actually admire its achievements, critically, of course, but genuinely. It pushes us towards a more grown-up ethics, as she puts it, something beyond simplistic slogans like greed is good or down with the bosses. It forces us to see how ideas, how rhetoric, how virtues like integrity, justice, temperance, professionalism, even faith and love are deeply intertwined with economic success and human flourishing. It makes progress a profoundly human, ethical story, not just a story about stuff. It's quite a liberating thought, I find.
It really is. What a fascinating, challenging perspective in Bourgeois Dignity. It genuinely reframes how you think about the last few centuries and where all this stuff and opportunity came from. So as we wrap up, what's a final thought for our listeners to sort of chew on after hearing all this?
Maybe consider this. If McCloskey is right, or even partly right, that the incredible prosperity we often take for granted was sparked by a shift in how people talked about and valued innovation and the ordinary virtues of commerce. What new habits of the lip might we need today? What kind of language, what kind of rhetoric, what shift in values could help us tackle our own massive challenges? Climate change, inequality, whatever they may be. Perhaps the solution isn't just in economic models or technology, but also in changing the stories we tell ourselves about human potential and cooperation.
That is a really powerful question to end on. A great challenge. Thank you so much for walking us through this deep dive into bourgeois dignity. We really hope this has given all of you listening a lot to think about and maybe a fresh perspective on how we got here and what might truly drive progress in the future.